This is David Dubal, and my guest tonight is Charles Rosen. It's hard to really describe very easily Charles Rosen because he is a universal man, and we don't describe universal men anymore. There are very few. Now, Charles would not probably say he's a universal man. He just does things. And today he brought in a 3-album set of piano music, some of the thorniest in all of the literature, some of the most wonderful, by Robert Schumann. It's on Nonsuch, and I would like to welcome Charles Rosen.
It's a great pleasure to be here, David.
Charles, you're always busy. Now, the first thing that astonished me recently is I'm walking on a bookstore into a bookstore on Madison Avenue, and what do I see? A title called Romanticism and Realism. And it's a book on French Romantic painting. Am I right?
Well, it's a book I did with Henry Zerner. It's not. It's actually a collection of articles that were then rewritten to make it into a real book. I mean, we did a lot of work on it, but we'd written these together for about 10 years. In fact, exactly 10 years. 1974 was when we started.
Well, it's a beautiful book. I had no idea that you were interested in romantic painting or realism or sculpture or anything, but now I realize that you're interested in everything, and eventually you get around to many subjects. This is a book that is published by Viking Penguin.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a beautiful book. I just read the first 2 pages. I couldn't afford it that moment, but I will get it, and I really didn't know that you had an interest in painting. When did that happen?
Well, I've always, gone to museums and so on, and Henry Zerner, who's an old friend of mine and who is now professor of fine arts at Harvard, was with me once when we visited the exhibition of academic painting, or actually of official academic painting of the 19th century, and that was in 1974. Somebody reconstituted the Museum of Modern Art of 1874 in Paris, and of course, we were both, Henry wasn't surprised because he knew what was going to be in it, but I was surprised that all the pictures were so awful, and that, with a few exceptions, and so we tried to figure out why was the government buying all these terrible pictures and refusing to buy Manet and Degas and Renoir and Monet and Courbet and so on. There wasn't a single painting by any of these people, the greatest painters in France. And actually, I had one idea of why the government wanted to buy this kind of painting, and Henry had another idea, and his was in fact much more brilliant than mine. But he said he would write it up if I wrote it with him, and so we wrote one article together. And it was written in French, but then it got translated into English, and we wrote 2 more articles, but which was so long that they had to be issued serially in the New York Review of Books and as reviews. And then finally we turned it into a real book. I mean, we did a lot of work because we'd written so much, it already looked like a book, so that's how it came about. Really.
Oh, it's fantastic.
I don't really pretend to any expertise in that, in the field of 19th century painting.
You don't pretend, but it reads like you truly know everything about it.
The expertise is Henry's, and
Charles, why did the French government not buy the Manets and so forth?
Well, because largely it was a question of the subject matter, that Manet refused. He insisted upon painting very, very contemporary subjects, which the government didn't want to buy. And second of all, he refused to give his paintings that high gloss or finish. And that, in fact, is, to a certain extent, what the book is about, or at least the major essay in the book is, why did the government insist that the paintings had to have this high finish instead of so that you couldn't see the brush strokes in the painting, which is you can always in Manet and in Degas. And the Impressionists, of course, you see lots of brush strokes. The government wouldn't buy that kind of painting. And we have a sort of long discussion, rather complicated, as to why this was the case.
Fascinating. I must read that. Well, governments getting into art of any kind is always a little crazy, isn't it?
Well, no, it was the sort of usual thing. I mean, normally the government was the one that it's only a modern idea that people buy art. It was generally,
yes.
I mean, it was back in the Middle Ages. It was the church which had an official status, which bought a lot of the art, or the local court which bought the art. And it's in the 19th century that art becomes more private. Actually, 17th Dutch painting is all private, but then Holland is, of course, a republic and
Yes.
a democracy. So
So interesting.
they have to sell to the middle class.
So, were these the exhibits around 1870s and 60s in Paris, which Baudelaire reviewed? That
Oh yeah, those are Baudelaire was the great critic of the 19th century, and he was the one who understood, who said that there's a great difference between a painting that has been finished in the sense of a high finish and a painting that has been completed. There are lots of paintings which have been completed which are not finished, he said, and that's
wonderful.
the basis of what we were just talking about.
Now, do you talk about Delacroix and Géricault?
Yes, that's the whole first part of the book is on that.
I was reading recently his journals, which remain so fresh. Delacroix's journals.
Delacroix, actually, it has the most fascinating and tantalizing entry in the whole 19th century. Is the one which says that Delacroix writes that Chopin has promised to come over this evening and explain Bach to me, and that's the only thing you know about it. You never heard what Chopin had to say on the subject of Bach. And since he was the composer of the 19th century most influenced by Bach and most intelligent in some ways, one would like to know what Chopin had to say, but that's all we know.
Well, I knew that we would move into music through Delacroix's journals. I knew you would say Chopin, and now, how do I get to Schumann? The only thing I could say is that the Kreisleriana, which you have recorded on Nonsuch, it's just coming out this week, the Kreisleriana, I believe, is dedicated to Chopin. So, that's...
yes, except that Chopin, when he got it... He made some nice remarks about the engraving of the title page, but he never said anything about the music. I think it shocked him.
Yes, and while poor Schumann working hard to promote Chopin in Germany, he never got the compliments returned. That's for sure.
Well, Chopin was very difficult. He really didn't like most people's music, like Mozart, like Bach, like Hummel. But of the composers who were alive, I think the only composer he really liked was probably Bellini.
Yes, I think he despised Berlioz, Liszt, so forth.
Yes.
Tell me, what are the works in this 3-record set that just came out on Nonsuch?
Well, I tried to pick the works which seemed to me the most radical, of Schumann, because he really did transform the whole idea of piano music, and so I picked the ones that seemed to me most original. And then I tried to play them in the original versions because he occasionally revised them, and he always revised them for the worse, in my opinion. So
yes, you did tell me that once before, and this indeed is the first recording of the original version of the Great C Major Fantasy.
That's right. The only difference, well, the main difference, there's small differences in parts of the other movements, but the main difference is at the very end of the last movement, which goes back to the beginning of the first movement in this original version. And if you see the manuscript which Alan Walker discovered at the Budapest Library, you will see that that the manuscript, which was in fact sent to the printers, that the last page is just crossed out, and he adds 2 measures of very perfunctory arpeggios to fill up the space.
Well, I heard you play the original version in Carnegie Hall.
Yes.
And it's just exquisite.
It is very beautiful. Yeah,
so now we have a recording of it. And, Charles, you also have Carnaval and the first version of the Kreisleriana.
Yes, well, the differences are not as great as in that one page of the Fantasie, although it changes the aspect of the piece a lot. Because one of the things he did in the second edition was to add a lot of repeats, so the second edition is much longer. Whereas the first, for example, the first piece goes by rather like lightning in the first version, and then he changed a lot of the cadences at the ends of pieces. The 4th and 5th piece in the original version don't really end; they just sort of melt away in a strange sound. And he gave them a very square cadence in the second edition. Did things like that. So, and the worst changes were probably made in the Davidspindler Tänze, which I play, where the opening page, the opening phrase, has an entirely different end in the second edition, and the ending of the first phrase is an ending of genius in the first edition, and he just struck it out. I mean, it's very hard to figure out why he did these things. I don't really pretend to understand why that came about.
And these changes were done late in his career.
Well, they were done in the 1850s, just before he voluntarily incarcerated himself in a lunatic asylum because he felt he was going mad.
Maybe he was getting out, I think, in fact, it was your theory, that he was getting out what he thought was very radical. because he himself was going insane.
I think he probably was trying to remove things that he thought would look mad or look insane. It's also, that he was classicizing. He'd been writing symphonies and quartets, and he was a little bit shocked by his own early work. And that's the other reason why I added, of the pieces that I have only one version that I put in the Carnaval and the F sharp minor sonata, because they seem to me such radical pieces too that I thought they belonged in this set.
Well, you just named in the F sharp minor sonata one of my favorite works. It's not easy to put over in the concert hall. It's easier to listen to on a recording, I think. Would you mind if I heard with you right now the aria movement of that great work?
It's a beautiful piece. No,
let's hear Charles Rosen from his new recording, a 3-record set, as a matter of fact, on Non-Such, the aria movement of the Schumann F sharp minor sonata. The artist Charles Rosen. You have just heard an exquisite rendering of a magnificent movement, the aria of the Schumann F sharp minor sonata from Charles Rosen's new Non-Such set. It's digital, 79062, if anyone is interested. And Charles Rosen is my guest, and we will be back right after this message. Charles Rosen is my guest, and Charles, you're happy with this 3-record set. You have told me that these albums have pleased you. You're not always easy to please.
There are always a few details that I regret now here and there, and after having, but on the whole, it's I was happy with the sound of it, and I recorded the Carnaval and the Davidsbundetense many years ago, and I think these performances are much better. So of course I'm happier about that.
Good. Now were these done in Holland as your last non-such set, the Beethoven
That's
set?
Right. Yeah, same place, same piano technician.
Wonderful.
This wonderful man, Mr. Coate, who would fix anything on a piano at a moment's notice.
And did you have any problem with the bells sounding? Remember there was a...
Oh yeah, we still had that.
Uh-huh.
But the engineer, Postuma, likes to use that hall, and I do too. And there's this beautiful church right next to. It's supposed to be the most beautiful church in Holland, but it also has the most famous bells in Holland. It rings the hours, so if you have to stop at when the hour bells are ringing.
So you did this in the Concertgebouw of Haarlem.
That's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is really covering a segment of repertoire which is. It's like the twilight zone of Romanticism in a way. You once said to me that it's not so simple to bring off some of Schumann's greatest works in public as it is, let's say, Chopin. Is that because of the great discursiveness of the pieces?
No, well, he actually was the composer who found a way to, as in the Kreisleriana or the Davidsbundetense or the Carnaval, to take a great number of very tiny little fragments and put them together as a whole. But then the pianist also has to hold them together, and it's a wonderful form. It really doesn't. I don't think there's any precedent for it anyway in music.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly Chopin never really tried it. And closest would come if you think of the preludes as a whole group of one piece or something, which I don't really. But the Schumann really does write cycles,
Mm-hmm.
like the song, the Dichterliebe, and so on. What's interesting to me is that he was writing song cycles before he wrote songs. That is, before he was writing anything for voice. The song cycle is really developed for the piano. The Davidsbundetense is the first great song cycle in a way.
Was his marriage with Clara a savior to him, or do you think that this classicizing effect of writing string quartets, symphonies, and so forth, was she the one who had that influence on him, thinking that maybe these pieces were too radical?
I wouldn't have thought so, really, on the whole. Is that the thing about it is that Schumann tended to write himself out in almost any field. He burns himself out. In other words, he writes all his piano music from the age of 20 to 28, and then he starts writing songs when he gets married to Clara, and the songs are very radical too. And he writes all of his songs in 2 years, or a year and a half, really. Mm-hmm. And then after that, he starts going into chamber music. He always did. It was always sketching symphonies and things like that, but he never actually completed any. And then after the piano music and the songs, he actually wrote a lot of chamber music and symphonies, which are very beautiful, but I don't think quite the revolutionary achievement that the songs and the piano music are.
Yes.
And but one can see how that works. For example, that there are a couple of beautiful piano pieces later in Schumann's life, not very many. One of them, well, the Waldszenen is the great example, but for example, they're the great canons for pedal piano. Mm-hmm. And he got this pedal piano that is a piano with a pedal keyboard like an organ, and he wrote 6 magnificent pieces for them.
Yes.
And then he wrote another set which wasn't as good. I mean, he burned himself out in that one too.
Yes,
I mean, and almost everything he sort of touched, he had this extraordinary inspiration in each medium. And the Waldszenen are very beautiful, but they have a kind of nostalgic and reflective quality, which you don't get the passion that they have, the earlier pieces have.
That's right. Of all those romantics circulating at that time, and they were a fascinating group, I would have loved to have known Schumann very much, more than anyone, I think. He seems to have been the freshest sensibility, the one who understood everyone.
I don't know. I find it hard to choose when I think of which one would be nice to know, was Chopin, Liszt, or Schumann, or even Berlioz. But
he would have been
Chopin was certainly the most intelligent. Liszt was the most generous and the most, the one who understood most of what was going on, and greatest sympathy for everything. And the greatest sympathy for all kinds of music, classical as well as romantic.
Liszt.
Yeah, Liszt.
And he must have been the most absolutely fascinating of them all as a magnetic personality.
Yeah. Chopin was in some ways probably the most profound and the most intense, but Schumann would have been fascinating to know too.
Are you doing a book on the Romantics yet?
Well, I gave those lectures at Harvard, the Norton lectures, and I've promised to turn in the manuscript fix up the manuscript for publication by the end of this year. So actually, that was one of the reasons I was doing so much Schumann. Was I was thinking about Schumann so much when I was. Maybe I think it was the other way around. I think I gave those Norton lectures because I was thinking that much about Schumann. In fact, more in some ways about Schumann than about Chopin and Liszt, whom I've played in a great deal all the time. But Schumann, I suddenly came around to things like the F-sharp minor sonata and went back to the Carnaval in a new way. And
so then you are turning the Norton lectures into a book.
Oh yeah, it has to be published.
Oh, that's
wonderful.
By
contract, so I've got to do it.
Well, that brings us to the fact that your most famous book, and that's not your little book on Schoenberg, by the way, but it's a wonderful book, but your most famous book is called The Classical Style, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, and that's translated in what, 6, 7, 10 languages?
No, I think 6.
That's fantastic for a book that is that difficult.
Well, it's out in Serbo-Croatian, which it's a language I can't read so I have no idea what the translation is like.
You have copies?
I've got I've got copies in Serbo-Croatian and in Hungarian, but the Hungarian I'm told is a very good translation.
We're going to go back to your playing now, Charles Rosen, and we're going to hear, and I know we seldom break up a masterpiece like this, and Schumann, though, was an understanding man. I think he even told Clara Schumann not to play all of the Carnaval at one time for fear of boring the audience, but times were different then. But we are going to play only the last 4 pieces of Carnaval Opus 9 in your new Nonsuch album, and I hope you don't mind.
No.
Because we're trying to give a taste of this album.
Well, all these pieces are so long. I mean,
yes.
I think 4 of the sides are over half an hour.
We'll program the whole of the work in a different time period. But let's hear the last 4 works, concluding with that great march from the Carnaval Opus 9, Robert Schumann, the pianist, my guest tonight, Charles Rosen. We just heard part of Schumann's great Carnaval in a very great performance by Charles Rosen on his brand new non-such 3-record set, put out digitally, of course. Everything is digitalis today, Charles. Put out digitally by non-such, and after hearing that, well, we have a million seller here. So I think I'll give the record number again, 79062 non-such. Do you mind if we take a break for a message and we'll be back with some Kreisleriana? My guest is Charles Rosen, and we have talked on numerous subjects, including his book with Henry Zerner, Romanticism and Realism. It's a work not on music, but on painting. And we talked about, well, you know what we didn't talk about? Another recording, which we're not playing tonight, which is on the label Etc., I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And if there's been any greater champion of Carter, I don't know who he is, but you have recorded his Night Fantasies, a fantastically intricate, almost Schumannesque work.
It is basically Schumannesque, because Elliot said he was listening to a lot of Schumann when he wrote that piece, and he was thinking of the Kreisleriana and the David
Really?
Carnaval when he wrote that. And well, I've always loved Elliot's music, in that he'd only written one solo piano piece in 1947, was a long time ago, and then 4 pianists, Paul Jacobs, Ursula Oppens, Gilbert Kalish, and I got together and asked him to write another one for us, and that's how the Night Fantasies came about. Beautiful piece, anyway, too.
Well, it's wonderful because now there are 2 recordings of this this massive new work of Carter.
Paul Jacobs did a beautiful one on None Such as well, yes.
And yours is on Etc., and on the other side the Piano Sonata, which was so important in the career of Carter.
That's right, yes.
Well, we're going to now hear numbers 4 and 5 from your most recent Schumann set of Kreisleriana, dedicated to Chopin. And this really is a rather enigmatic work in many ways. It's certainly not the first work of Schumann one should hear, probably.
No, but it's very beautiful. It was, in some ways, with the Davidsbündel, the most personal work.
Yes.
Yeah.
You mind if we hear 4 and 5 of the, 8 fantasies that consist of this great Opus 16?
Yeah, they're beautiful and very contrasting, too.
Let's hear Kreisleriana in the hands of Charles Rosen. That was Charles Rosen in a performance of the fourth and fifth of Kreisleriana by Schumann, and we will be back with more music from Rosen's new 3-album, what is it called? 3-record set, Charles. And if you'll wait a moment, we'll be back after these messages. Charles, one of the works on your new Nonsuch is the first performance on record of the first version of Schumann's Fantasie. And, well, this, as with most Schumann works, has more than meets the eye. It was written for, in a sense, a Beethoven memorial, right?
Well, it's based on a theme from Beethoven, on the last song of To a Distant Beloved, to An die ferne Geliebte, which is actually the material that it's based on is only quoted at the end of the first movement. You only hear all the themes really are related to that, but you only hear the original form, so to speak, at the end of the first piece. It's a very extraordinary idea to do that. I don't think anybody's ever written a piece before in which the material is presented at the end instead of the beginning.
Well, did Schumann ever do anything that was exactly like anyone else? No.
I don't think so.
No.
Well, he occasionally tried, but he never succeeded.
Charles, there is also a work on here, and I should sum up what's on this this marvelous collection of music that you've just recorded in Holland on Nonsuch. And there is the great Fantasie, the great Kreisleriana, the unbelievable Sonata in F sharp minor, Opus 11. The most famous of all the solo pieces probably is the Carnaval, right?
Yes.
And there's what else? The
Daviddubalsociety.
Oh,
which is the most personal piece that Schumann ever wrote in some ways.
And to start off side one, there's a work that I've only heard myself a few times and never in public performance. Impromptus on a theme of Clara Wieck.
I think along with it was a choice. I was going to put either that or the Papillon. The Papillon is more often played, and the impromptus are never played. I've never heard anybody play the impromptus in public except myself.
And you like them, obviously.
Oh yes, I think they're very beautiful. The piece is a little awkward in one or two spots, but it contains some of the most eloquent and the most original things that Schumann did, and which he was to develop later. And I mean, if you want to see the beginnings of Schumann's originality and really radical changes that he was making in music, then you really have to start with the impromptus. I think which is why I put it in, and I loved in fact recording it. So that was.
Oh, this is wonderful, because this gives us another taste, and this is also that first edition.
Yeah, that he changed enormously in the second. The second edition is almost an entirely different piece and a much less interesting piece altogether. And
I would like very much to hear the Ruins movement. That's the first movement of the Fantasie, right?
That's right. He gave titles to it in the original called Ruins and Arch of Triumph and Constellation. It's beautiful. The titles are very beautiful. I'm sorry he struck them out, so I've put them back in, since I'm playing the original version.
Exactly. And he says that this is to be played fantastically and passionately throughout. That's such a characteristic desire of Schumann's. Well, are you ready? Because I am. The first movement of Schumann's Fantasie. This one's dedicated to Liszt.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. the first movement of the great Fantasie of Schumann in the hands of Charles Rosen. Charles, I've been privileged to taste this album with you and our audience, and I thank you very much for coming.
It's a great pleasure to see you, David. It's a great pleasure to be here.
This is David Dubal, and thank you for listening.